So in my previous video, part 2, we left off on the fifth element of the treaty. So I'm going to pick it up right here with the sixth essential element of the suzerain vassal treaties, which mirrored the covenant in Deuteronomy. Now, during the covenant ceremony, the vassal publicly recited self-imprecatory curses, which was done under oath, which brings us to the sixth essential element of a treaty or covenant. These are the oaths that were sworn by both parties, with particular emphasis on the vassal, who was required to comply with the terms of the treaty at the threat of the self-imposed precatory curses of the treaty. You see this in Deuteronomy 27:11-26 there on the bottom of the screen. Now, let's delve into this a little bit deeper through the only unerring guide, the Word of God. Exodus 19:1 contains the historical prologue of the treaty, a summary of the vassal's past relationship with the author of the treaty, which reads, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine." Exodus 19:4 and 5. So Yahweh delivered ancient Israel out of Egyptian bondage with the greatest series of miracles in ancient Israel's history. This will show you Israel's disposition, their attitude or mindset. This is what governs the behavior of unbelievers in any and all situations, in any and all eras. In delivering ancient Israel out of Egyptian bondage, he performed 10 miracles. Let's look at them briefly here. This is where they committed apostasy. Why? Because Psalm 78:22a says, because they did not believe in God. But they deceived him with their mouth and lied to him with their tongue. Psalm 78:59 reads, "When God heard, he was filled with wrath and greatly abhorred Israel." So there were 10 miracles that God performed in the presence of the ancient Israelites in delivering them out of Egyptian bondage. They are the water in the Nile turned blood, including all other water sources. The frogs swarming into Egyptian homes and palaces, not in Israelite homes. The lice or the gnats, where dust was transformed into lice on the Egyptians and their animals, not on the Israelites. Swarms of insects plaguing Egypt, but not Israel. Livestock pestilence, which killed Egyptian livestock. Boils, painful sores afflicting Egyptians and their animals. Number 7, hail from heaven, destroying all Egypt's crops and property. The locusts, number 8, consuming what remained of the crops. Number 9, the darkness, covering Egypt for 3 days. And then, last of all, the death of all of Egypt's firstborn, both human and animals. Israel's were spared by the Passover. And this is not to mention the parting of the Red Sea after their deliverance from Egyptian bondage, and every other miracle Yahweh performed during the 40-year wilderness wandering period. You see, Psalm 78 is an inspired record of Israelite history beginning with the Exodus on through the 40-year wilderness wandering period into the entrance into the Promised Land and up to the time of David. It is a psalm which goes back and forth from these various periods with no consistent pattern, though it contrasts God's gracious acts with corporate Israel's persistent rebellion. And so God invited Israel to enter into a covenant with him shortly after their arrival at Sinai, and they quote-unquote accepted, but this was mere lip service, as is evidenced by Israel's persistent rebellion to be faithful to the covenant, culminating in their worship of the golden calf. So despite all of God's miracles, they still continued to rebel against God. And this is why the process of establishing the covenant at Sinai was interrupted, namely Israel's apostasy, worshiping the golden calf. And just speaking to you as a brother or sister in the Lord, I want to remind you, the psalm reminds us that even though we are unfaithful as Christians, God remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. The first generation of male Israelites over the age of 20 were degenerate, with the exception of Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. You see this in Numbers 26, verses 64 and 65. You see, Israel's apostasy interrupted the process of establishing an ancient Near Eastern treaty or covenant. You see, in the ancient world in which Israel dwelt, covenants or treaties were established through a formal process recognizable in a sequence of public, ritualized steps. Against this backdrop, Israel's apostasy can be framed as a breach that disrupted covenant ratification. And this is quite frankly what Israel missed out on. In the ancient world, a covenant ceremony was similar to a wedding ceremony, in that both were legally established at the conclusion of the ceremony. I elaborate on this in great detail in Part 4 in this series. The swearing of the self-imprecatory curses were similar to the I do's in a modern-day wedding ceremony, and the handing of the vassal's copy of the treaty tablet to the vassal king at the very end of the ceremony was very similar to a groom placing the wedding ring on the bride's finger. When both of these occurred, on one hand, the justice of the peace, or the person marrying the couple, could pronounce the couple, quote unquote, man and wife. On the other hand, in the ancient world, the treaty was established at this moment. It was at this precise moment that the treaty was legally binding. Let me explain this as it has been explained by one, Victor Korosek, a professional lawyer and legal historian, particularly in ancient Near Eastern and Mesopotamian law codes. His expertise was on the treaties as legally binding instruments. I'm going to be enlarging this section right here. And the information I will be presenting here is taken from Ugaritica 3, a scholarly volume published in 1956 as part of a series on Ugarit. It presents the latest archaeological discoveries from Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit, with a strong focus on Hittite seals and cylinder seals. The volume brings together contributions from multiple specialists and illustrates the international character of Ugarit during the Late Bronze Age, highlighting its political, cultural, and administrative connections with the Hittite Empire, Egypt, and Cyprus. The image on the right is an enhanced photograph of a stele discovered as Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit, in the Levant. If you'll recall, the region where 382 suzerain vassal letters were discovered, which we covered at the outset of this video. The stele bears an inscription describing an oath-taking ceremony that formed an essential element of suzerain vassal treaty ratification. During this prearranged ceremonial act, treaty protocol required both the suzerain and the vassal king to raise their hands over their own copy of the treaty tablet, thereby formally invoking the oath binding the two parties to the conditions of the treaty. It was at this precise moment that Victor Korosek argued that the quote-unquote treaty comes into being. This scene visually emphasizes the binding, reciprocal, and formally sanctioning nature of the treaty in the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia. Such iconographic evidence supports Korosek's insistence that the treaty did not come into being until the vassal was handed his copy of the treaty text. And this is why I stated at the outset, when we were discussing the Levant, that the Amarna letters prove that covenant treaty language and protocol were already standardized centuries before Israel's arrival. This is omnipotent evidence that the covenant in Deuteronomy was not established until Israel was handed a copy of the treaty text and then placed it into the ark a portable shrine in the Promised Land. The conclusion then here at this point is that Deuteronomy belongs to the same treaty tradition revealed by Amarna and preserved by the Hittites. And now I want to introduce you to the true pioneer of our revolutionized understanding of the covenantal framework in the Pentateuch, Old Testament scholar and professional lawyer, Professor Victor Korosek, who I've been mentioning here throughout this video. You know, I have always wondered why Korosek's groundbreaking monograph on the similarities between the Hittite state treaties of the 2nd millennium BCE and the covenantal framework in the Pentateuch has never been translated into English to this very day. If you will recall, in the introduction video in this series, Jim raised this question, quote, "Why did it take so long for scholars to grab hold of this and then write about it?" He's talking about after Archibald Sayce's discovery of the Hittites, why did it take so long, 75 years, for English-speaking theologians to write about it? The answer to Jim's question is simply this. Korosek's pioneering, groundbreaking monograph was written strictly in German in 1931, entitled Hittite State Treaties, a contribution to their legal evaluation, and has remained untranslated into English even as I speak. As a result, and I say this poignantly, Korosek remains the quote-unquote forgotten pioneer on this subject within the non-scholarly community. Nevertheless, 20th century astute scholars consistently recognize Victor Korosek as the true pioneer of our understanding of the striking similarities between the Hittite treaties and the covenantal framework in the Pentateuch, not George Mendenhall, all due respect. Now, I could go on and on about Korosek's erudition, believe me I could, but I will limit this due to time restraints. Korosek was the leading scholar in the ancient law codes of the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia, with particular emphasis on Hittite law. This should tell you something about his deep pedigree. Prior to 1931, Korosek identified the systematic structure of the earliest Hittite legal collections and translated them into Slovenian. His work extended beyond Hittite material to include major ancient Near Eastern and Mesopotamian law codes such as the Code of Hammurabi, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian legal texts, and, not to mention, Roman law. Clearly, then, Korosek was not merely a theologian like Mendenhall. He was a professionally trained lawyer and legal historian. His seminary professors recognized him early on as possessing a rare, disciplined gift for deciphering legal systems. So without Korosek, Mendenhall and many other scholars could not have written on this topic. Therefore, Korosek's work supplied the structural baseline that made Mendenhall's and subsequent scholars' reinterpretation of the many facets of the Pentateuch possible. And so here is a summary of the contributions Korosek left you and I, which are sure to help you experience liberty. I say it again, liberty, as you finally recognize just where you stand in relation to the law of Moses. Korosek provided us with one of the earliest systematic legal analysis of Hittite treaties. Not only did he lay the legal groundwork for subsequent scholars, but he identified what I have deemed as the quote-unquote crown jewel of the discoveries related to the covenantal framework in the Pentateuch. The crown jewel. He was the scholar who discerned how and when a covenant, quote-unquote, comes into being, as he put it, when the treaty text is handed to the vassal. This, my friends, is revolutionary, liberating, as you will see very clearly when we get to parts 3 and 4. The significance of his work. It provided guidance for subsequent scholars who were untrained in ancient legal procedures. He delineated ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, and his work demonstrated that Hittite treaties were legal documents and that they were structurally consistent, and more importantly, that they were legally binding agreements, not myths. And so Korosek's monograph marked a decisive turning point, not only in the church's understanding of the covenantal framework in the Pentateuch, but by and large in its understanding of God's covenants with us as Christians as it relates to the new covenant. So by identifying the Hittite treaties as formal, legally binding instruments, Korosek left you and I, including Bible students of all denominations, even in the cults, an interpretive tool which we can use to uncover certain hidden obscurities in the Pentateuch, much the way many employ the writings of Flavius Josephus to uncover certain obscurities in the Gospels and the book of Acts, which are hidden due to time and cross-culture. And so, winding this section down, the relevance of Korosek's work to biblical studies. He provided a legal framework for comparing the Deuteronomic covenant with the Hittite treaties. The covenant literary structure in Deuteronomy mirrors the Hittite treaties of the second millennium BCE. In fact, his work confirms the Mosaic law covenant was a legal institution. In addition, Korosek laid the groundwork for subsequent scholars. For example, George Mendenhall applied Korosek's legal insights to his analysis of the similarities between the Deuteronomic covenant and the suzerain vassal treaties of the Hittite Empire. Also, D.J. McCarthy refined covenant ceremony analysis somewhat, though he also built on Korosek's work. Then there is Klaus Baltzer, who provided a detailed outline of the treaty schema, and beyond this, into the Didache. Now let's continue our examination as we seek to answer the decisive question this presentation has been moving towards, namely the significance of the shattering of the two stone tablets and how it affects you and I. With that understanding in place, the shattering of the two stone tablets is not mere symbolism. It becomes legally decisive, thanks in our understanding to Victor Korosek. Zooming forward 25 years after Korosek's seminal work, George Mendenhall's two-part peer-reviewed scholarly article appeared in English, allowing English readers to finally benefit from Korosek's groundbreaking discovery. It appeared in The Biblical Archaeologist in May and September of 1954 under the separate titles Ancient Covenant Forms and Covenant Forms in Israelite Tradition. It was subsequently published the following year as a full-length monograph entitled Law and Covenant in Israel and the Ancient Near East. Mendenhall's publication has done little to impact my study, no disrespect intended, because I felt he was writing more as a systematic theologian than an objective analyst, seeing things in the Pentateuch that were not really there, such as implied curses in the so-called Decalogue. Meredith Kline, a Reformed and Covenant theologian who also has written on the subject, was much the same, though he did make one extraordinary, and I mean extraordinary, observation, which I will share with you later in this series. But returning to Mendenhall, to his credit, at least Mendenhall rightly affirmed many of the parallels previously identified by Korosek. However, he applied them in a manner that obscured, rather than clarified, the sharp distinction between Exodus and Deuteronomy, the two covenants. Now, one last point of importance before we move on from here. Prior to Korosek's groundbreaking discovery, the numerous differences between the covenant in Exodus and the covenant in Deuteronomy left scholars completely baffled. Numerous attempts have been made to reconcile these discrepancies over the past several centuries, resulting in an entire body of literature, including several monographs entitled The Problem of Deuteronomy, one in 1928 by Griffith, and another one in 1929 by Adam Welch. And herein lies the problem. Despite the foundational work of Korosek, followed by Mendenhall's and a limited number of subsequent scholars, significant confusion continues to persist among evangelical interpreters, including the cults like Seventh-day Adventism and the Jehovah's Witnesses. This confusion largely stems from treating the Pentateuch as a single flattened literary and legal corpus governed by one uniform system of law, rather than recognizing it as a historically developing and interrupted attempt to establish a covenant at Sinai, but was ultimately established in the Promised Land. Well, now we're really going to sink our teeth into this subject, so pay particular attention, especially if you are a Seventh-day Adventist. I want you to hear what two scholars who have made major contributions to Korosak's work have to say regarding the strong affinities that the Hittite treaties share with the covenantal framework in the Pentateuch. First up is D.J. McCarthy, commenting in his book Treaty and Covenant, which was released in 1978. This citation is taken from the introduction, and I will be enlarging this section right here. McCarthy made the following observation. Listen carefully what he has written. In these documents, one who knows something about the Old Testament finds himself on strangely familiar ground. Notice that. Dropping down right here. However, it is the form, the structure of the treaty as a whole, which is striking. This becomes clear if we set certain salient features from the treaty and from the Old Testament side by side. In the classic form, there are 6 members, and McCarthy is referring to the 6 elements we examined near the outset of this examination. Next up is Claus Balzer. This is taken from Claus Balzer's very fine treatment of the Hittite treaties and the biblical covenants, the Covenant Formulary, which appeared in 1971. Commenting on the 6 elements that were consistently present in the Hittite treaties, Balzer has written, "This schema can be found with minor variations in all the treaties. It remains so constant that, if a treaty is preserved only in fragments, they can be arranged in order with a high degree of assurance. One can also determine, for example, which parts are missing." So in other words, Balzer is saying that even if the tablets were broken in numerous pieces, you could put the tablet back together with little difficulty. Sort of like putting a picture puzzle together, huh? This is because the Hittite treaties always followed a particular literary pattern or structure. And the same can be said about the way a covenant ceremony was carried out and concluded with the handing of the treaty text to the vassal. Now, moving towards our goal, I want to shift gears here and put this examination into overdrive. We have been focusing most of our attention on the 6 elements of a treaty or covenant per se, and there they are listed on the screen for you there. Now, please pay particular attention here because I am about to make a subtle distinction in all of this, which some students often confuse. Now we're going to switch gears here and we're going to look at the 7 elements of a covenant ceremony. And like the literary structure of the covenant in Deuteronomy, the 7 elements of the Deuteronomy covenant ceremony also mirror the Hittite covenant ceremony process. You see this delineated in the last 2 books of the Hexateuch, Deuteronomy and Joshua. And I cover this in great detail in part 4 in this series. So, the 7 elements of the covenant ceremony are the recital of the laws or stipulations of the treaty, the invocation of witnesses, the recital of the blessings and curses, the oaths sworn by the vassal. Number 5, the deposit of the stone tablets, the treaty text, into the ark or the portable shrine. 6th are the recital of the threatened curses for tampering with the treaty text. And finally, the instructions for periodic public reading of the treaty stipulations. So be careful not to confuse these 7 elements of the treaty ceremony with the 6 elements of the treaty per se. And now I'm going to raise the temperature in the room. So it's probably going to get a bit uncomfortable here. That is, if you're a Seventh-day Adventist. And of course, I don't have to tell you where I got this from. My partner and everyone's friend, Jim. If it's in Seventh-day Adventist literature, Jim will find it. This helpful citation is taken from page 30 in the December 1960 edition of Ministry Magazine. You can see page 30 right here. And I will be enlarging this section right here, which reads, God communicates divine truth to us in language we can understand. In his dealings with Abraham, he used thought patterns familiar to that patriarch and expressed his covenant in terms of the covenant form in use in Abraham's day. And what form was that? Why, the Hittite treaty form. Now, wasn't this very kind of the organization to accommodate me like this? Let's continue. In the day of Moses, he used what was apparently an international covenant form for expressing divine truth regarding his own relationship to his people Israel. Now notice the footnote number 5. It's a reference to Mendenhall's 1954 article in the Biblical Archaeologist. Again, wasn't that very kind of them to accommodate us like this? So, conclusion at this stage. The General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists have done Jim and myself a tremendous favor here. They affirm the validity of what I have been arguing from the outset in this video, namely that God used an already existing international treaty form, that of the Hittites, which had already been standardized for centuries, as a pattern for establishing his covenant with Israel. And it is the one we read about in Deuteronomy, not Exodus, since that covenant was annulled before it ever got off the ground. And he established his covenant long before Abraham and the nation of Israel ever appeared on the scene of human history. And they cite Mendenhall's publication in support of their claim. Wasn't that accommodating of them? Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. If you're an Adventist, in Job 38, 8 through 11, God speaks of the time when he filled the seas full of water throughout the entire planet at creation, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. What a spectacle that must have been to behold. Well, God has created another spectacle involving a vast amount of water, though this time is metaphorical, and boy, is it deadly. Like I said in the introduction, the shattering of the 2 stone tablets creates a tsunami-like death blow to Seventh-day Adventism's foundation, the Sabbath in Exodus 20. And this has damning salvific consequences for Adventists. You see, the significance of the shattering of the 2 stone tablets had been hidden from us for centuries until Victor Korosek made his discovery in 1931. And this is the irony of it. Things like this will always come back to bite you, and Ellen G. White was completely unaware of what it meant when someone shattered stone tablets in the ancient world when she constructed her deadly Sabbath doctrine. Well, God has everything covered when it comes to false teachers, and what he did was pull the rug from underneath Ellen White, a dreamer of dreams. And I will lay this out for you in great detail in the next 2 videos. But for now, let us start bringing this video to its conclusion, setting the stage for part 3 in this series. As Victor Korosek argued, a treaty or covenant ceremony was not complete, and a covenant was not established until all 7 of these elements of a treaty ceremony were implemented. These 7 elements that I pointed out earlier. And notice that the treaty tablets had to be present on site. This is missing in Exodus. You see, this picture illustrates the importance of this tragic truth for Adventists. If you'll remember, the tablets had to be deposited into the ark. This is why the priest is holding them up. Let's wrap this up. Victor Korosek passed all state exams with honors, and in 1924, he graduated from the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana, and there he received his doctorate in 1926. I mentioned that Klaus Balzer authored an absolute standout publication furthering Koresek's work. I want to close this video by citing a portion of Balzer's book on the precise moment an ancient treaty was established in the ancient world. This is something I will never forget reading. Balzer made the following observation. But what is the relationship between the quote-unquote treaty and the conclusion of the treaty ceremony? According to Korosek, quote, this is Korosek speaking now, in line with the view prevalent everywhere in the ancient Near East, execution in writing is essential to the conclusion of a treaty ceremony. The treaty document is not merely evidence of a treaty that exists, say, by virtue of a mutual agreement. The relationship between the document and the conclusion of the treaty ceremony is therefore extremely intimate. The treaty comes into being only when the document is written. It is called, quote, tablet of binding and incantation, end quote. The treaty comes into being when the great king exhibits the treaty and seals it and gives it to the vassal. These actions are consistent with the treaty, end quote. This is taken from the Covenant Formulary, pages 16 and 17. So this is what this examination has been driving towards. Namely, this is an absolutely essential element that is glaringly missing in Exodus. The covenant ceremony process was interrupted by Israel's apostasy, worshiping the golden calf. So the covenant in Exodus never got off the ground. Therefore, as my buddy Jim rightly argues, the first set of stone tablets containing the treaty text never made it into the ark, which was another essential element in ancient Near Eastern treaty ceremony protocol. And so I hope that you have found this tutorial of great benefit. So until next time, when I begin a full-orbited Bible study, taking you by the hand and walking you through the last 5 books of the Hexateuch, citing chapter and verse in support of every one of my claims. This is Angel Ariano Jr. reminding you to do all things according to the Scriptures.